the state projections better than Lisa Hammersley. Lisa, welcome here to CCM.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that. So I too would like to thank Matt Galligan for coming up, especially from Florida, to come and talk to you all about a task force that he worked on and was the president of on behalf of CCM. So thank you very much, Mike. This one? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, Brian. So for those of you who don't know us, the School and State Finance Project is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We were originally established in 2015 to work solely on education finance issues. However, over the years, our education was more and more eager to talk about all things related to finance, and so we changed our name and our mission and goals to better reflect the work that we're doing. So currently, we're the School and State Finance Project. And essentially, our organization uses data, analyzes data that is publicly available to create policy solutions to the state's education finance challenges, as well as state finance challenges more globally. We try to work with the public to build knowledge about the state education finance issues, as well as state finance issues, and to work with other stakeholders in order to get public policy passed to address some of the issues that we found through our data analysis. So before I move on, I would just like to provide a little bit of context. Back in 2017, the General Assembly established a special education cost cooperative task force. This is a policy that our organization has worked on basically since its inception. And we came up with the policy idea after talking to municipal officials as well as school superintendents who kept talking about the unpredictability of special education costs and the havoc that unpredictable expenditures are having on their budget. And so our organization looked at the data, looked at the numbers, and found that the numbers suggest that statewide special education expenses are quite predictable. On the local level, they're certainly very volatile. And so they crafted this policy solution to deal with that issue. And the task force met and looked at a number of different models. And in the end, they reported those models to the General Assembly for their consideration. In this legislative session, we have a bill that is going to be heard before the Education Committee that would go ahead and make the task force work and put it into effect by creating a board to deal with these issues. But I'll go into greater detail as we go through the presentation. So as you know, there are a number of steps with regards to special education. You have the identification of the student with special needs. You have the IEP and the PPT process. You have the actual provision of services for these children. And then you also have how are we going to fund these services. What we're talking about today deals solely with funding the special education services. It does not impact at all over identification, the PPT process, or the IEP process. So just backing up to look at the data of what's going on statewide. Across the state, the school's population is decreasing. Over the past 10 years, it has decreased by 6.5%. However, at the same time, the number of students with special needs has increased by almost 20%. Excess cost students, which is the population that we're looking specifically at, has been approximately steady and level over the past 5 years. So this suggests to our organization, and the data supports it, that while excess costs are going up, they're going up on a statewide level at a pretty predictable 3% annually. And what we're finding is that students are simply moving from district to district to capture services in different municipalities. And so we're going to create a cooperative that will leverage that statewide predictability and funnel it down to the local level. So looking at the cost per student, just to clarify, the task force, when they looked at the models, they looked at two models. One that captured all special education students. That was the model that our organization originally established and talked about. However, the task force felt that removing 25% of a municipality's ECS grant to go into a cooperative pool would probably not be politically feasible. And they also thought that starting out with just the small excess cost pool would probably be a better place to start. So we're looking here at just excess cost kids, which are approximately 4,200 statewide. It's less than 1% of the total school population. So excess cost kids, as you know, are defined as those students whose expenses are more than 4.5 times what you spend generally per pupil in your town. And these excess cost kids have extraordinary needs and therefore have very large expenses. So on average, statewide, the average expenditure per student for a non-special needs child is approximately $13,500. However, an excess cost student on average costs the district over $108,000. There's a number of different ways in which the state currently supports special education services. Statewide special education services total $2 billion a year. As you know, as you know, a majority of that funding comes from the local municipality. The state of Connecticut only shares approximately $600 million of that expense. Of the total special education expenditure statewide, 23% is special education tuition expenses. A large majority of the excess cost kids are those that are outplaced outside of the district. 25% of your ECS grant is attributed to special education. Back in 1995, the General Assembly decided that they were going to increase the foundation level. That's the level with which they estimate a non-need student cost to educate. They increased it by $911 to reflect the special education component of the ECS grant. So as a result, 25% of your ECS grant is supposed to be helping to defray costs associated with special education in your town. And the ECS grant accounted for 57% of special education spending by the state in fiscal year 2017. As I previously mentioned, the excess cost grant are those grants that are for students that are above 4.5 times your per pupil expenditure. The state of Connecticut has been level funding this grant at approximately $140 million a year. As you know, this grant is not fully funded. The state of Connecticut, at its $140 million a year, is providing reimbursement to municipalities for approximately 74% of the expenses. That means that municipalities, you all have to fully provide dollars to support kids from once your ECS grant is hit all the way up until that 4.5 times. And then once you get up to that 4.5 times, which is a very high level, you then have to pick up 30% of the cost beyond that. So because the excess cost grant is based on how much each municipality is spending per pupil, it varies by district. Danbury, who expends the lowest amount per pupil in the state, their threshold kicks in at just over $57,000. However, the town of Cornwall, which spends a lot per pupil in their district, they would hit the excess cost threshold after they spent $158,000 to support a child. The next slide just shows the difference between what is actually appropriated by the General Assembly as compared to what is fully funded. As you can see, in order to fully fund this grant, the General Assembly would need to increase the appropriation by over $60 million. There's a number of problems with special education funding, as you know. The first is the fact that it's unpredictable at the local level. The municipalities do not know how much to budget. If a child moves in mid-year that you were not anticipating, you could have a significant budget deficit that you need to deal with mid-year. The Board of Education may have to reduce costs in order to try and reduce their expenses in order to deal with this unforeseen expense. Also, the Board of Education can go back to the town to try and ask for a supplemental appropriation. So there are a number of issues with unpredictability at the local level. In addition, it's not equitable. The excess cost grant is one that once you get up to 4.5 times, all municipalities, regardless of their ability to pay, are eligible for the same percentage reimbursement from the state of Connecticut. And it's also financially burdensome because excess cost is not fully funded. The municipalities are picking up the additional 30% above the 4.5 times threshold. There's also a problem with the donut hole, which is what I just referred to, in so much as the municipality has to pick up 100% of the expenses from their ECS grant all the way up to the 4.5 times threshold. So speaking specifically about the policy that we've been working on for a number of years, the cooperative. As I mentioned, the task force worked under the great guidance of Matt Galligan. They worked with a number of consultants. Our organization worked specifically with UConn and their actuarial science. However, the task force hired their own independent actuary to confirm and validate the work that UConn had done. We also had work from Pullman and Comley that dealt with the legal analysis and whether implementing a cooperative would impact IDEA regulations in any way. And Morgan and Lewis also worked on governance structures for a cooperative, which would be a captive insurance company. And we chose a captive insurance company because they are highly regulated in the state of Connecticut, so it would be under the purview of the insurance department. In addition, because the co-op board, because it is a captive insurance, the cooperative board, those that direct and manage the captive insurance company, would be wholly owned by municipalities, boards of education in the state of Connecticut. In addition, by taking these funds and putting it into a captive insurance company, they are not available to be swept by the General Assembly if they ever find that they're in fiscal distress and need additional money. So the co-op solves 3 challenges of the 4 that I've previously mentioned. It makes cost predictable at the local level. It makes cost predictable in the current year. Also, we have worked on a number of models with Aon, one of which makes cost more predictable on a year-to-year basis. And so it makes cost predictable at the local level. If you have expenses that you did not anticipate or you did not budget for, the districts would be reimbursed 100% for that expense. It also increases equity. The models that we have put together and that the task force looked at use different measures to promote equity in the excess cost reimbursement. We use the public investment community in our latest model. That is a measure that is currently used in the ECS grant. So we thought, and it was a very holistic view of a municipality's ability to pay. And it also reduces the burden on school districts. It preserves education services in a district if unforeseen expenses come up, and it would prevent the need for a supplemental appropriation from a town. So as I previously mentioned, the co-op is an education finance system that allows the state and local government to share in education expenses and excess cost expenses. However, it would keep the delivery or all decision-making regarding the delivery of services local. This model is not intended to act as a cost control. As previously mentioned, we do not interfere with the delivery of services at all. However, there is an aspect of the co-op that could promote cost reductions in the future. This aspect is regards to data collection. So currently, with outplaced providers, the state of Connecticut has no information or data on how much these providers are charging municipalities for the same service. They could be charging different municipalities different amounts, and they could completely be arbitrary. So the fact that the co-op board would have access to this data, they can look at trends and they can look at how much outplacement providers are charging, and they can make recommendations to the General Assembly for changes in legislation to reduce those costs. As I previously mentioned, the co-op is a risk pool. The state contribution would come from their excess grant appropriation. The General Assembly is not anticipating to increase the appropriation at this time, so they would put their $140 million into the co-op. And then municipalities would make the contribution to the co-op. It could be based on their resident student count, and it could be based on an equity adjustment. So the bill that is before the Education Committee does not set a certain formula that should be employed by the co-op to determine municipal contributions. The bill before the Education Committee establishes the board, and the board would have 4 representatives from local officials on the board, and the board would do their work with their own actuaries to determine the formula to determine a municipality's contribution to the cooperative. However, in the legislation, it makes it very clear that under no circumstance shall a municipality's contribution to the board exceed their excess costs for the prior fiscal year. So no municipality would be required to supplement any other municipality's excess costs. In addition, the bill makes it very clear that all school districts shall receive 100% of their excess costs in any given year. And as I previously mentioned, the co-op essentially leverages the statewide predictability to give that predictability down to the local government. It's very important to look at what the co-op does and does not do. So the co-op addresses predictability current year and future years for municipal budgets. Municipalities would know in December for the following fiscal year how much they would contribute to the co-op. Essentially, the excess cost expenses would come out of the school district's budget and it would become a municipal contribution. And by doing that, you remove excess costs from municipalities' MBR. And it also solves a problem with mid-year reductions and unforeseen expenses and the need for a supplemental municipal appropriation. However, it does not address burden of proof. It does not address the identification of students or the delivery of students or any mandates or any regionalization of services. This infographic just shows how the co-op would work. The state's contribution would go into the co-op. The town's contribution would go into the co-op. The co-op would be owned by municipalities and boards of education, and then school districts would be reimbursed 100% from the cooperative. We've already talked about the excess cost grant. We do put in here that the state could decide to increase their contribution towards excess costs. I mean, ideally, the state should be contributing 100% of this grant reimbursement. However, at that time, that's not being considered. However, there would be bonding or some other surplus appropriation from the state of Connecticut in order to get the cooperative up and running. This is deemed to be low risk by the insurance department, and so it is estimated that approximately $50 to $80 million would be required for the state to infuse the co-op with its initial capitalization. So additional legislative action would be required in the following legislative session to get these resources over to the co-op so that they can be up and running. The final amount that would be required to capitalize the cooperative would be determined on the final model that is employed by the board, the captive board. Just to talk specifically about the bill that's before the Education Committee, it requires incorporators to establish the board. So they're basically just going to put the board in place, and these are legislative appointments. The board would consist of 17 members, of which 4 would be municipal representatives, 2 from CCM and 2 from cost. And the board is charged with developing the model that would be employed to determine a municipal contribution. The board would also have to make other decisions, such as the frequency of reimbursement to districts. Currently, it's twice a year. However, the board can decide to do that more frequently. In addition, the cooperative is estimated by the actuaries to generate conservatively $5 million in investment income. And the board can decide that they're going to use that money to infuse additional non-municipal support towards excess costs, thereby increasing the percentage of full funding annually over the years as that $5 million continues to accrue. The bill requires that no municipality shall pay more than their previous year's excess costs and that all districts shall be reimbursed for 100% of their expenses. In addition, SDE would continue to receive all reimbursement requests and approve all reimbursement requests. This cooperative would have would not be involved at all with the approval of reimbursement requests from municipalities. They're all volunteers. We've gotten questions on the administrative expense of the co-op. The actuaries estimate that it would be less than $500,000 annually, which of course can be paid for with the investment income that is generated by the cooperative. It's essentially just a check payer. They're just cutting a check to local school districts, and we would use probably a consultant, a third-party billing system to do that for us. or they would use that. We would not be involved actually after this policy is implemented. And so another great component for municipalities is the fact that it removes these volatile expenses from your municipal MVR. So if you have a student move into your district and they cost $200,000 a year to educate, and they're in your district for 1 year, and you support that child, of course, as you need to, and then that child moves out of your district the following year, you're still held at that artificially high budgeted amount for education through your MVR. This bill would take those expenses out of the MVR so that with this super volatile expense, you're not held to an artificially high level. And the board, as I previously mentioned, is required to report on outplacement costs. So this could lead to future cost savings for districts to the extent that there's actually data collected and analyzed regarding how much outplacement providers are charging. And that is the end of my presentation. We handed out a packet to you all that has a number of pieces of information for you to peruse at your availability. The first is a summary from the actuaries Aon on the latest model that we've employed that we asked them to put together for us that really solve the issue of year-over-year volatility for school districts. We also have a one-pager, a timeline that shows how quickly this would go into effect. So if this bill were to pass the General Assembly, excess costs would not be covered under the cooperative until fiscal year 2022. There's a number of things that need to occur between now and then in order to get this up and running, including having the board actually determine the model that would be employed. And there's also an infographic that tries to break down and simplify how the co-op works because it's pretty complicated. I would welcome any questions that you may have at this time.
Yes.